Hello. In this video, I'm going to analyze an argument against the minimum wage that may or may not have been expressed by Ben Shapiro, partly on his show and partly on Twitter. And I'm going to argue that this argument fails to justify its conclusion since it relies on some highly questionable premises that we've got no good reason to accept. Now, I say he may or may not have expressed this argument because anytime you try to interpret and reconstruct someone's argument, there's a possibility of misinterpreting them. So, even if it turns out he wouldn't endorse this argument, I still think it's worth seeing why this argument fails. Okay, so let's get to the quotes from which we'll attempt to extract the argument. So, he said the following on his show, quote, "If you had to work more than one job to have a roof over your head or food on the table, you probably shouldn't have taken the job that's not paying you enough. That'd be a you problem." Now, someone tweeted out the clip of him saying this, and he was accused of poor shaming and criticized in various other ways, so he replied to that tweet with the following, quote, "The point I am making, of course, is that you cannot dictate that a job pay you what you wish it paid you. That is obvious, and why it is foolishness for politicians to claim that the economy can be structured to force your desired level of pay from a job you chose to take." Okay, so let's attempt to extract an argument from these quotes. I think the premise is contained in this quote. If you had to work more than one job, that'd be a you problem. Okay? Now, there's going to have to be some other premises, and then I think the conclusion is contained in this quote. The point is that you cannot dictate that a job pay you what you wish it paid you. Now, I think it's reasonable to interpret this as the conclusion, since he took to Twitter to say that this is the point he was trying to make with the original quote. In other words, he was originally offering a premise that if you have to work more than one job, it's a you problem, in support of the conclusion that you cannot dictate that a job pay you what you wish it paid you. Okay, so now let's try to restate the premise and the conclusion in a way that's a little bit more clear. Okay, so this is my interpretation. I think the premise is something like this. People who need to work multiple jobs are responsible for their situation. I think this is the main point being made by the original quote. And then there are going to be some other premises. So now let's see if we can figure out what the conclusion is supposed to be. In his second quote, he says, "The point is that you cannot dictate that a job pay you what you wish it paid you." So what is he talking about here? Now, I don't think it's charitable to interpret him as arguing that random people in their jobs shouldn't just be able to demand whatever they want and get it, since no one's proposing this, right? This argument was made in response to minimum wage proposals, so I think it's reasonable to interpret the conclusion as having to do with the minimum wage. Now, let's take a look at the word cannot that occurs in this second quote. Is he arguing that it's not possible to implement the minimum wage? Well, I don't think that'd be a very charitable interpretation since it's clearly possible, right? We have minimum wage laws now. Could he instead be arguing that it's not possible to implement the minimum wage without really bad economic consequences? Well, he probably does believe that, but I don't think this is a reasonable interpretation of the conclusion. Why is that? Well, notice that the premise is a claim about responsibility, and I think the idea is that this is the sort of responsibility that's relevant to what you do and do not deserve. And so if he were merely making the economic argument that the minimum wage has bad consequences, this claim about what people are responsible for or what they deserve would just be irrelevant to that point. So I don't think it's charitable to interpret him as making the economic point. So I think we should instead interpret him as making the primarily moral claim that we should not implement minimum wage laws. Okay? So I think this is a reasonable interpretation of the premise and the conclusion that he expressed. Now let's see if we can reconstruct the rest of the argument, as in fill in the necessary details. Okay? So we have this first premise, people who need to work multiple jobs are responsible for their situation. And then we have the conclusion, therefore we should not implement minimum wage laws. Now, clearly as stated, this is invalid, right? This conclusion doesn't follow from this premise alone. So I think the charitable interpretation would be to say that there are some suppressed premises here. So let's see if we can make them explicit, okay? I think the second premise is going to be something like the following. If they are responsible for their situation, then they do not deserve assistance. And I think the third premise is going to be something like, if they do not deserve assistance, then we should not implement minimum wage laws. Now, you need this second premise in order to connect the claim about responsibility to this claim about what people do and do not deserve, right? He's making a desert-based argument against the minimum wage. and then you need this third premise to connect the claim about desert to this moral claim about what we should or shouldn't do. Okay? So, I think this is a reasonable reconstruction of the argument that may or may not have been expressed by Ben Shapiro. So now let's look at each premise on its own and think about what the support for that premise is, and then see whether or not we should accept it. Okay? So, premise 1 says, people who need to work multiple jobs are responsible for their situation. Okay, so how should we interpret this? Is he talking about all people? Well, I don't think that'd be a very charitable interpretation, since I'm sure he would have to admit that there are going to be some people, right, who aren't responsible, even if he thinks most people are. Nor is it charitable to interpret him as only meaning some people. That's far too weak a claim to get to the moral conclusion he wants. Okay? I think it's a lot more plausible to interpret him as meaning most people, or people in general, or typically people who need to work multiple jobs are responsible for their situation. Okay? So let's keep that in mind moving forward. Let's also think about the word responsible that occurs in this premise. We have to keep in mind that he seems to be making a desert-based argument against the minimum wage. So we should remember that when we use this word responsible, we mean it in the sense that's supposed to be relevant to what people do and do not deserve. Okay? Now, how might we defend this premise? Well, before I get there, I want to first note that there are some cases in which something bad happens to someone, but none of us would say they're responsible for the situation, right? If someone gets mugged, then most of us wouldn't say that they're responsible for losing the money. Why is that? Well, even though they could have refused to give up their money, the alternative would have been them being harmed in some way, and that just doesn't seem like a reasonable alternative. So it seems like having some reasonable alternative is a necessary condition for being responsible in the relevant sense. So perhaps Ben Shapiro is going to argue that not only is having reasonable alternatives a necessary condition for being responsible, it's also a sufficient condition. And I think there's some evidence that this is what he has in mind in the quote that he made, right? He says, "You probably shouldn't have taken the job that's not paying you enough. That'd be a you problem." So it seems like he's suggesting that, look, people have some reasonable alternative to working multiple jobs, and that's why they're responsible. Okay, so let's try to reconstruct this into an argument in defense of premise P1. I call this the reasonable alternative argument. Premise R1, people who need to work multiple jobs have some reasonable alternative. Premise R2, if they have some reasonable alternative, then they are responsible for their situation. Conclusion, so people who need to work multiple jobs are responsible for their situation. Okay, so this is an argument in support of premise P1, and I think it's plausible that it's what Ben Shapiro had in mind when he made this quote. So, should we accept it? Well, first, let's look at the second premise. If they have some reasonable alternative, then they are responsible for their situation. In other words, this premise is claiming that having a reasonable alternative is sufficient for being responsible in the relevant sense. Now, I think you could challenge this premise. You could say that, look, even if people have reasonable alternative, they're not necessarily responsible in the relevant sense, and that's because there are a myriad of other factors that give rise to the situation. For instance, there's luck, there's different circumstances of birth, different opportunities. In other words, there are tons of things that are outside of our control that play some role in bringing about the relevant situation. Okay? So that's one way you might challenge the idea that having a reasonable alternative is sufficient for being responsible in the relevant sense. However, even if we grant the second premise, I think this first premise is the highly questionable one, right? People who need to work multiple jobs have some reasonable alternative. And remember that we're interpreting him as talking about most people, or people in general. Okay. Now, this premise is partly empirical and partly moral. The empirical component is about what alternatives people have available to them. That's not something we can settle from the armchair. But the moral component is about what alternatives count as reasonable. Now, I'm not really qualified to comment on the empirical point. However, I do find it to be highly questionable, and I think we're not justified in accepting it absent substantial empirical arguments. So that's why I think we shouldn't accept this first premise, and as a consequence, we've got no good reason to accept premise P1, at least not on the basis of this argument. Okay, so now let's look at the second premise. The second premise says, if they are responsible for their situation, then they do not deserve assistance. Okay? Now, I'm not going to say too much about this premise, but it does seem to assume that people only deserve assistance if they are not responsible for their bad situation. Now, you might find this plausible, You might not, but here's a potential challenge to it, right? You might just think that, look, everyone, in virtue of their humanity or personhood or sentience or whatever, is deserving of some assistance. In other words, you might just say that by default, because of the very thing that people are, they are deserving of some assistance. Now, I think the discussion of this premise runs the risk of getting into verbal dispute territory, since there might be different senses of desert, and which claims we accept depend on which sense is being expressed, right? You might just say that, look, it's part of the very meaning of desert that you only deserve things that you're responsible for. And so you can't deserve things merely for being a human or being a person or being sentient, right? Things that are outside of your control, things that you're not responsible for. Now, I don't think this is an unreasonable challenge, but in order to avoid the verbal disputes, I'll just move on from discussing this premise. So that brings us to premise 3, right? Premise 3 says, if they do not deserve assistance, then we should not implement minimum wage laws, okay? So remember, this is the premise connecting the claim about desert to this moral claim about what we should and shouldn't do policy-wise. Now, what is this connection between this desert claim and this moral claim? I'm going to try to charitably construct an argument in defense of this premise that I think is behind Ben Shapiro's thinking, okay? I'm pretty sure he would endorse this argument, but if not, there might be some of you who do, so let's take a look. I call this no desert-based reasons, okay? Premise N1, if they do not deserve assistance, then there are no desert-based reasons to implement minimum wage laws. Premise N2, we should not implement minimum wage laws unless there are desert-based reasons to do so. Conclusion, therefore, if they do not deserve assistance, then we should not implement minimum wage laws. What do I mean by a desert-based reason? Well, I mean some reason for implementing a policy that appeals to a claim about what people do or do not deserve, okay? So if part of the reason you support the minimum wage is that you think people deserve it, that would be a desert-based reason, okay? Any reason that appeals to something other than desert would be a non-desert based reason. In other words, if you make the economic argument that people overall will be better off if we implement these laws, or if you make a rights-based argument that people have a right to it, those are not desert-based arguments. Now, the basic idea behind this argument is that there are allegedly some compelling reasons against implementing the minimum wage, right? Maybe these are economic arguments, maybe they're entitlement or rights-based arguments, but the important thing is there are compelling reasons against. And those could only be overridden if there were desert-based reasons in favor. In other words, if it could be shown that working people deserve to have minimum wage laws. And so if we can show that the desert-based reasons fail or don't apply, then the reasons against will be decisive. Okay, so that's the idea behind the argument. Let's look at each premise on its own. Now, premise N1 says if they, the people who need to work multiple jobs, do not deserve assistance, then there are no desert-based reasons to implement minimum wage laws. Now, we have to remember that we're talking about most people who need to work multiple jobs, right? So even if it's true that most people who need to work multiple jobs don't deserve assistance, there still might be some outliers who do, okay? And so there might still be some desert-based reasons to implement the minimum wage. However, I won't quibble with this premise too much. We can grant this premise. I think it's premise N2 that's the highly questionable one, right? Premise N2 says we should not implement minimum wage laws unless there are desert-based reasons to do so, okay? So the idea behind this premise is, again, there are compelling reasons against implementing the minimum wage. I'm sure Ben Shapiro believes there are good economic reasons and good entitlement or rights-based reasons, and so the only things that could potentially outweigh those reasons are some desert-based reasons, and if those don't apply, then we should not implement minimum wage laws. Now, I think this premise is highly questionable because I think it's highly controversial that there are indeed those compelling reasons against. There are many who would claim that there are good overall economic consequences of implementing the minimum wage, and there are many who would challenge the entitlement-based arguments against. So we're not justified in accepting this premise absent a substantial economic or rights-based argument, okay? And so that's why I think on its own, we've got no good reason to accept this premise, and as a consequence, we've got no good reason to accept premise P3. Okay, so now let's return one more time to the full argument. I think this argument fails to justify its conclusion since it relies on two highly questionable premises, right? I think you could potentially challenge premise P2, but premises P1 and P3 are extremely questionable, and we don't have a good reason to accept them absent a substantial argument, right? Premise P1 assumes that most people in this position have some reasonable alternative, and I think that's a highly questionable assumption, okay? Definitely needs a substantial defense. And premise P3 assumes that, absent any desert-based reasons, there are decisive reasons against implementing the minimum wage laws. And I think that assumption is also highly questionable and requires a substantial defense. And so that's why I think this argument fails to justify its conclusion in its present state, absent a substantial defense of those highly questionable assumptions. All right? But if you think those assumptions can be defended, then I wish you good fortune in the culture wars to come. And now it begins.